There exists an invisible threshold between life and death that all human beings will cross. But what if this threshold could be crossed twice? In the ancient city of Joppa, on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, an ordinary woman named Tabitha crossed this final frontier and returned to tell the story. Her body had already grown cold. Her eyes, once bright and attentive to the work of her skilled hands, had already lost their sparkle. The tears of those who loved her had already been shed. Her body had already been prepared for burial. And then the impossible happened. How did a simple seamstress, without wealth or positions of power, manage to mobilize an entire city less than 2 days after her death? What happened in the 48 hours between her last breath and her inexplicable return to life that transformed not only her existence, but the faith of an entire community? This is the story of Tabitha, also known as Dorcas, the only woman in all of Scripture explicitly called a disciple. A woman whose hands created more than just garments, they created hope. A woman whose life was so extraordinary in its simplicity that even death could not contain it. Among the many miracles recorded in the pages of the Bible, Tabitha's case stands out for its deeply human dimension. This story brings a perspective on the power of quiet generosity that few know about, and how seemingly small acts can echo throughout eternity. The Mediterranean shimmered like a cloak of liquid sapphires on the horizon of ancient Joppa, today's Jaffa, one of the oldest port cities in the world. Around 36 AD, this city bustled with activity. Phoenician merchants bringing purple dye from the depths of the sea, caravans with spices from the east, fishermen casting their nets into the turquoise waters. A mixture of cultures, languages and religions intertwined in the narrow, winding streets. It was a world in transformation. The Roman Empire ruled with an iron fist, but a new faith was being born on the margins of society. The followers of Jesus of Nazareth, executed just a few years earlier, were growing in number despite persecution. They called themselves the Way even before they became known as Christians. Joppa housed a small community of these followers, mainly Jews who believed that Jesus was the promised Messiah. They lived differently, sharing their possessions, caring for those in need, and meeting in homes to break bread and tell stories about their master. In this setting lived Tabitha, whose name in Aramaic means gazelle. In Greek, she was known as Dorcas. An ordinary woman at first glance, she wasn't wealthy like the Roman matrons, nor did she belong to the Jewish priestly elite. She was an artisan, a seamstress whose skilled hands transformed simple pieces of fabric into tunics and cloaks. Imagine her hands. They weren't soft and protected like those of a noble woman, but marked by constant work, small scars from needles, calluses formed by years of holding resistant fabrics, short nails for precise work. They were hands that told a story of service. Tabitha's house wasn't grand, probably a simple stone structure with a small inner courtyard, where under natural light, she worked on her fabrics. Work table filled with colorful scraps, baskets with wool and linen, carefully stored bone needles, precious tools of her trade. Society in those days didn't value women. In Roman culture, they were the property of their fathers and then of their husbands. In Jewish tradition, although there was more protection, they had few legal rights. Tabitha, apparently without family, lived in a particularly vulnerable situation. Widows formed the most helpless class in that society. Without husbands to protect them, and often without children to support them, they quickly fell into extreme poverty. There was no social assistance, retirement or insurance. A widow depended solely on the charity of others to survive. It was among these forgotten women that Tabitha found her purpose. While the powerful debated politics in halls and the religious discussed traditions in temples, she quietly revolutionized her community with needle and thread. Her work didn't just cover bodies, it restored dignity. The Romans built marble temples to impress. The priests conducted elaborate ceremonies to demonstrate piety. Tabitha simply sewed, one stitch after another, creating a legacy that not even she could imagine. Tabitha's routine began even before the sun rose over the Mediterranean horizon. Like many women of the time, She woke with the first roosters, lit her oil lamp, and prepared for another day of work. A piece of bread, perhaps a little goat cheese and olives, constituted her simple breakfast. The first hours of the morning were dedicated to organizing her materials. Tabitha carefully separated the fabrics by color and texture: coarse wool for outer tunics that protected from the cold, finer linen for inner garments that touched the skin. The needles, made of polished bone, were checked for sharpness and strength. Thread of various shades, dyed with natural colorants, indigo for blue, madder root for red, saffron for yellow, were wound onto small wooden spools. Women began to arrive at her door when the sun was already high. First came the older widows, those whose bodies already felt the weight of years. Tabitha received them with kindness, inviting them to sit on woven mats while she served them fresh water in ceramic bowls. "Look, Rebecca, I finished your cloak last night. The embroidery on the sleeves will protect your arms from the cold wind that comes from the sea." The elderly woman, whose fingers, now deformed by age, could no longer hold a needle, received the garment with tears in her eyes. It wasn't just a cloak, it was proof that she still mattered to someone in this world. Tabitha didn't just give away clothes, she taught younger women to sew, thus creating a network of mutual support. In a society where women rarely had access to formal education, these lessons were precious, a form of independence, a means of survival. The afternoons were generally dedicated to visits. Tabitha walked through the narrow alleys of Joppa, a fabric bag over her shoulder containing simple remedies, food, and of course clothing. She visited the sick, the abandoned elderly, families who had lost their livelihood. She never announced her arrival with trumpets or sought recognition. She simply appeared where she was needed. During one of these visits, she met Sarah, a young mother whose husband, a fisherman, had drowned during a sudden storm. With 3 small children and no family in the city, her situation was desperate. Tabitha not only provided clothes for the children, but also taught Sarah to make wool rugs, a skill that would eventually allow her to support her children. The evenings in her small house were dedicated to prayer and more meticulous work. By the flickering light of oil lamps, Tabitha embroidered details on tunics, delicate seams that transformed simple cloths into durable pieces. While her hands worked, her mind repeated the teachings of Jesus that she had learned from the apostles. "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Days added up to weeks, weeks to months, months to years. Tabitha's reputation grew quietly, not like the great orators in public squares, but like the dew that falls during the night, imperceptible in its process, but vital in its result. Then came the illness. It started as simple fatigue, a difficulty in standing for long periods. Tabitha ignored it initially. There was much work to be done, many people depending on her. The fever came next, consuming her strength like fire consuming oil. The women she had helped for so many years now gathered around her bed, trying to return her kindness. They brought medicinal herbs, prepared strengthening broths, applied cold compresses to her burning forehead. They took turns day and night, whispering prayers, telling stories to keep her connected to the world of the living. For a brief moment, it seemed the crisis had passed. Tabitha managed to sit up, accepted a little broth, even smiled at her worried friends. She picked up a needle and a piece of fabric, insisting that she needed to finish a cloak for the approaching winter. It was at this moment, with the needle still in her hands, that Tabitha took her last breath. The needle fell to the packed earth floor with an almost imperceptible sound. The room filled with the lament of women, not the ritual crying common at funerals of the time, but the genuine weeping of those who had lost not just a benefactor, but a true friend. Following Jewish customs, Tabitha's body was carefully washed. Aromatic oils were applied to her skin, a practice to mask the odor of decomposition and show respect to the deceased. Wrapped in a simple shroud of white linen, she was placed in the upper room of her house, awaiting burial that would occur the next day. The news spread quickly throughout Joppa, not through official proclamations, but through the whispers of ordinary people whose lives had been touched by Tabitha. Fishermen at the harbor, merchants in the marketplace, families gathered for the evening meal, all shared stories about the disciple whose needle had sewn more than fabric. It was at this critical moment that someone remembered Peter the apostle was in Lydda, a nearby town, less than a day's journey away. Perhaps he could know it would be asking too much. Resurrection, that only happened in stories about Jesus. Still, hope, even faint, was better than no hope at all. 2 men were dispatched immediately. They ran along the coastal road, sweat streaming down their faces, ignoring fatigue. The message was simple: come without delay. Nothing more needed to be said. Peter arrived in Joppa as the sun began to set on the horizon. He was immediately led to Tabitha's house, now surrounded by a silent crowd. He climbed the stairs to the upper room, where he found a scene that deeply moved him. The widows gathered in a circle around the body weren't just crying, they were showing the tunics and cloaks that Tabitha had made. Each piece told a story: a cloak for an elderly woman who shivered from cold, a tunic for a young woman who had nothing to wear to the market, small clothes for orphaned children. She made this when my grandson was born, during that terrible winter. She sewed this for me when I lost everything in the fire. She taught my daughters this embroidery, so they could earn their own living. Peter observed in silence. These weren't just clothes, they were evidence of a life truly lived in service to others. What happened next transcends common understanding. Peter asked everyone to leave the room. Alone with Tabitha's body, he knelt and prayed. We don't know the exact words of his prayer, but we know that he spoke directly to the body. Tabitha, arise. What few people know is that this moment directly echoes Jesus' actions when he raised Jairus' daughter with the words Tabitha Kumi, little girl, arise. The similarity between Talitha and Tabitha is no coincidence. It's a poetic echo that connects these 2 miracles across time and space, demonstrating the continuity of divine power through the apostles. Even more surprising is the fact that, in the entire New Testament, only 3 resurrections are described in detail after Jesus' death: the resurrection of Lazarus by Christ himself, the resurrection of the young man Eutychus by Paul, and this resurrection of Tabitha by Peter. Among the 3, Tabitha is the only woman, highlighting the extraordinary importance that the author of Acts attributed to this event. The biblical text simply tells us that she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter she sat up. The sobriety of this description contrasts dramatically with the magnitude of the event. Imagine the moment, the first breath after death, the first heartbeat renewing the flow of life, the first sensation of consciousness returning to the body. What Tabitha saw or experienced while she was dead remains a mystery. The sacred text keeps silent on this question, leaving space for contemplation. Unlike modern near-death experiences, there are no reports of light at the end of a tunnel, meetings with deceased loved ones, or sensations of indescribable peace. The focus of the narrative is not on the beyond, but on the return, and on the impact of this return. Peter took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. A simple and profoundly human gesture, the touch that connects, that affirms, that welcomes back to the world of the living. And then, in an act that reveals his true priority, he called for the saints and widows and presented her alive. This sequence is revealing. Peter didn't immediately take Tabitha to the religious authorities to validate the miracle. He didn't display her in the public square to impress crowds. He first called those who loved her, those who had mourned her loss, those whose faith would be most strengthened by her return. The reaction of the widows is not described, but we can imagine it. The initial shock, the disbelief, followed by explosions of joy, embraces, tears of happiness. The same hands that had washed her body for burial now touched her in celebration of renewed life. The biblical text mentions that this became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. This seemingly simple phrase hides an extraordinary revelation about the impact of women's ministry in the early church. Tabitha's resurrection wasn't just an isolated miraculous event, it was a catalyst for mass conversion in an entire city. Even more impressive is the fact that this wave of conversions didn't result from Peter's eloquent preaching in the marketplace, nor from sophisticated theological debates. It resulted from the restoration of a woman whose ministry was sewing clothes for needy widows. The implication is profound. In divine eyes, this domestic service was as valuable as the sermons of the apostles. Another rarely noticed detail is that Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon. This extended stay suggests that Peter recognized the strategic importance of what had happened. It wasn't a detour in his mission, but an extension of it. The apostle understood that the spiritual ground in Joppa had been prepared by Tabitha's quiet ministry long before his arrival. Few readers also perceive the connection between this event and what happens immediately after in the biblical narrative. It is while staying at Simon the tanner's house in Joppa that Peter receives the vision of the sheet descending from heaven with unclean animals, leading him to understand that the gospel is for all nations. This revelation, which completely transformed the trajectory of the early church by opening it to the Gentiles, occurred geographically at the exact location where Tabitha had prepared the way. Another layer of meaning rarely explored is in the name Dorcas itself, the Greek version of Tabitha. Gazelle in ancient symbolism represented grace, beauty, and keen vision. Gazelles are known for their ability to spot predators from a distance, alerting the entire herd to imminent danger. Similarly, Tabitha had the spiritual vision to identify needs that others ignored, and the grace to meet them with beauty and dignity. There is also an intriguing parallel between Tabitha and the virtuous woman described in Proverbs 31. Both used their textile skills not just for ornament, but for service. Both extended a hand to the poor and opened their mouths with wisdom. Tabitha's resurrection can be seen as a divine affirmation of this ideal of femininity that transcends the limited roles imposed by society. To discover more fascinating stories like this one, simply subscribe to the channel. There are many other biblical characters whose lives contain layers of meaning that are rarely explored in conventional sermons, stories of ordinary people through whom the extraordinary manifested itself. Tabitha's story resonates deeply with issues we face today. In a world obsessed with greatness, fame, and instant recognition, she reminds us of the transformative power of simple acts performed with consistency and love. How often do we seek to impact the world through grand gestures, when perhaps our true calling is to serve faithfully in the small circle of influence entrusted to us? Tabitha never preached to crowds, never wrote epistles, never formally led churches, and yet her impact was so significant that the Holy Spirit himself inspired Luke to record her story for all future generations. This narrative also confronts us with our modern definitions of success and meaning. In contemporary culture, we often measure value through visible achievements, accumulation of goods, social media followers, or impressive titles. Tabitha challenges us to consider that perhaps our true legacy is measured in the lives we touch, the tears we wipe away, the needs we meet when no one is taking photos to share online. There is something deeply moving about the fact that it was the widows who mourned her death and showed the clothes she had made. Not religious authorities with ornate tunics, not political leaders with official seals, but simple women whose lives had been transformed by her generosity. They were her most eloquent testimony, living proof that a life dedicated to service is never wasted. When Peter called Tabitha back to life, he wasn't just performing an isolated miracle. He was affirming the eternal value of compassionate service. He was declaring that in divine eyes, the seamstress is worth as much as the apostle, that hands holding needles are as sacred as those writing epistles. Perhaps the most important question this story leaves us with is, what tunics and cloaks are we creating in our own lives? What tangible evidence of love will remain when our name is mentioned? What circle of people would mourn our absence not out of social obligation, but out of genuine gratitude for the way our lives touched theirs? Tabitha's resurrection was an extraordinary event, but her ordinary life was equally miraculous. In every stitch, in every visit to a sick person, in every act of kindness, she participated in the divine work of restoration. Without realizing it, she was weaving not just clothes, but the very kingdom of God on earth, one stitch at a time. If there is a final lesson to be learned from this resurrected disciple, perhaps it is this: eternity is already interwoven into our ordinary days. What we do in the silence of our daily routines echoes in the heavenly economy. It is not just the great moments that define our lives, but the consistency with which we choose to love in the moments that no one sees. Tabitha, the seamstress who returned from death, shows us that no act of genuine love is too small to be noticed by heaven. And perhaps in the end it is not our great deeds that matter most, but our faithful presence in the lives of those God places in our path. As the ancient rabbis said, to save one life is to save an entire world. Tabitha saved many worlds, one cloak at a time.